Hi everyone and welcome to week 2 video 1. Today we're going to be speaking about inequality, how we measure it, what the general trends have been in the last decades and even centuries around the world and for major economies in particular. Okay, let's get started. So after we introduce some fundamental concepts relating to inequality, we'll then look at three dominant ways of measuring inequality. So there's intergenerational mobility. This has to do with family and how income can differ from one generation to the next, or wealth or consumption or other variables. Then we have personal income inequality. Perhaps this is the one you're most familiar with. This is the difference between incomes between people or sections of society when ordered from poorest to richest. And then we have functional income inequality, and we'll get into what that means a little later on. Okay, but before we get into those well-defined measures of inequality, let's just think about how incomes have developed around the world since 1800. Here's this wonderful graph from gapminder.com. And what we see is distributions of income in terms of dollars per day in purchasing power parity. The height of the hump gives you some idea of the number of people on the planet at this point in time, beginning in 1800 and we'll go all the way up to 2015. And on the x-axis we see, yes, the dollars per day. Note that is not a linear axis. Okay, so we're just going to press play here and see what happens. So what we're going to see is that, yeah, population growth is growing. But notice here we've got the extreme poverty line as defined by the UN, under $2 a day. And as expected, the earlier in time you are, the more people are living in extreme poverty as defined today. Okay, fine. Let's continue. Keep in mind that the pink is the Asian countries, in yellow we have Europe, and green we have North America, and blue we have Africa. Okay, so already at the beginning of the 20th century, we're seeing that largely it's the European and North American economies which are really striding past that extreme poverty line and pushing to the right. In fact, we're starting to see a bit of a long-tailed distribution where most of the poor countries tend to be in Asia and Africa, and we're seeing the Western world kind of pull apart or pull away. Okay. Now, as we go into the late or second half of the 20th century, we see this interesting phenomenon. We see this second hump. So a two-humped economy. Perhaps I'll just go forward a little bit. And again, it's really the West that leads in the second hump. And we have this clear split between developing and developed economies. Notice out the Asian economies, essentially it's Japan and South Korea to some extent, maybe already, that's pulling ahead. But predominantly at this stage, the Asian economies are below that extreme poverty line. But look at that massive change that occurs since the end of the 20th century. We see that that two-hump shape has disappeared as the Asian economies and some African economies do catch up to a larger extent, with the majority of the Chinese population and a greater majority of the Indian population now above that extreme poverty line. Okay, so what we see is, yes, extreme poverty rates have gone down considerably, as we'd expect, with technological progress and everything that goes with it, since the 1800s. But we also see the distribution of incomes around the world as a whole has grown considerably between 1800 and today. It's not that we have this same shape shifted upwards, maybe a bit higher. No, we've also seen the width or the variation of the distribution grow quite considerably as well. And we see that on the world scale, but we also see it within country too. If you see the width of these individual distributions, they have grown quite a bit too. So implicitly in this graph, we can see some reflection on how inequality has changed over time, just by looking at the width. And we can also see, well, that there are few people than ever in extreme poverty. Okay, so now let's go into more detail on how we can construct these more precise measures of inequality. But before we do that, let's speak about the fundamental concepts behind inequality. So why care about inequality at all? Well, there are two main categories, if you like. There are the intrinsic reasons. These are the more philosophical reasons, where one would say, well, inequality is simply undesirable in and of itself. Ethically, morally, this is bad. If we want to live virtuous lives, then we want to minimize this. Then we've got the second category, which is the instrumental reasons. This is perhaps the category that economists tend to focus more on. And this is the idea that, well, inequality is undesirable because it has undesirable effects on outcomes that we care about. These could be economic outcomes, such as GDP, income and production, or unemployment. And if higher inequality leads to higher unemployment, perhaps for that reason, someone might say we must reduce the level of inequality. But it could also have undesirable outcomes or effects on social political outcomes. So this could be the distrust of others, incarceration rates, health outcomes like obesity and so on. Quite a thought-provoking book was published in 2009 by these epidemiologists, I believe, Pickett and Wilkinson, who basically showed this correlation between higher inequality and various economic and social political indicators like the ones I just mentioned. And they showed that this correlation is holds between different countries for various variables over a long period of analysis. So we can look at those social political outcomes as well as those economic outcomes and say, well, therefore inequality surely must be kept below some level at least. Maybe not to eliminate it completely, but at least keep it in check. The second question might be, well, equality of what exactly? There are two fundamental concepts here. We have the idea of equality of opportunity, which says, in principle, everyone should have the same chance to achieve a goal, but not everyone may achieve this said goal once given the chance. So this is about the opportunity, it's about the chance and access to it. And then the second notion is the equality of outcomes. So if you desire the equality of outcomes in terms of income or consumption or healthcare or education or wealth, then it's not really about ensuring people have the same chances. It's about ensuring that they end up with the same results, or at least there shouldn't be a wide disparity in these results. So again, this is more of a fundamental philosophical distinction that is good to keep in mind when thinking about these issues. So we have various dimensions of inequality, as I briefly mentioned in the table of contents. We have socioeconomic mobility. Well, this is tracking changes in income or wealth or any other variable of interest of a given family over time. So, for example, what is the difference between a son's income and his father's income? We're going to get a little bit into this, but only very briefly in this presentation. We have the personal distribution. What fraction of income or wealth does each member of the population receive? Not considered as part of a family, but considered as part of the society as a whole. And then we have the functional income distribution, which asks, well, what fraction of income or wealth do workers receive as opposed to capitalists? So we know that GDP can be expressed as the wage bill plus the total profit level. So essentially, if you look at, well, that wage bill expressed as a fraction of GDP, you've got your a measure of functional distribution. What share of total GDP is going to workers, is going to labor? So this asks about, yes, the notion or the split of income based on the function performed. We're not going to be speaking too much about the intrinsic reasons in the rest of this course, but I would like to begin or at least contemplate this example that is provided more from the psychological sciences, but it's very much relevant or related to what we're doing here. So we're just going to briefly touch upon these intrinsic reasons rather than the instrumental reasons. So if we have a look here, this in this graph, we have what is the actual distribution of wealth in the US. So the top 20% wealthiest people in the US own more than 80% of wealth. A staggering maldistribution, if you like, or at least skewed distribution in the US of wealth. And that drops quite dramatically, quite quickly, right? So from the richest 20 or the wealthiest 20% to the second wealthiest 20%, there's quite a gap between it goes from 80 down to what looks like 15 or close to 10%. The third quintile registers around 5%, and then for the second and first, it barely registers at all. You can hardly see it. In fact, there will be some people at the very bottom of this distribution who have negative wealth. How can that be? Well, simply they hold more debts than they own assets. So the first quintile could actually be in a negative territory, although I do believe it is actually something like 0.1 or something. Okay. Now, what these authors have done is essentially ask or survey people and ask them, well, how high do you think the wealth inequality is in the US? So they ask people in a survey, without showing them the data beforehand, well, how high do you think, or how much of the wealth of the US do you think the top 20% own? And people answered, on average, around 60%. And you see the averages, or the estimated averages, for the rest of the quintiles here. So people know that the US is unequal in terms of its wealth distribution, but they don't quite see they don't quite accurately know how unequal it is. So that's the first takeaway. That's already quite interesting. Now, in the second question in this survey, people were asked, well, what would be the ideal distribution in your opinion? Yeah. Not appealing to any outcome, just appealing to some sense of fairness. How did they define this ideal? Well, if you're at all familiar with the ideas of Rawls and his idea of the veil of ignorance, basically the survey respondents were asked to consider before coming into life, before stepping into society and knowing your place within society, how would you like society to be such that you could enter society and not mind about where you are placed within it? If you're randomly allocated a place in society, what would the distribution of wealth be such that you would be quite happy to, randomly walk into any part of the society, whether it be working class or rich or so on? And then based on that setup, the ideal that was reported by the survey respondents was dramatically lower then. So here we have, a wealth inequality distribution in the ideal sense, where the top 20% own about 30% and the bottom 20 may be close to 15 or above 10%. So what we see is, firstly, people have misunderstood or don't quite see the actual distribution of wealth, in America at least. And secondly, it's far from their ideal. So it's quite important that, more data, more discussion is held on these topics, because even from these intrinsic reasons of fairness and so on, it seems that we're quite far away, or at least in America, we're quite far away from what would be considered a virtuous or good distribution from intrinsic perspective. And note that these results are similar when you control for income, gender, and even political affiliation, which is quite interesting because maybe you'd expect Democrats to give you this kind of result, and maybe Republicans would give you a more skewed result. But even when you control for that political affiliation, these authors found that the results were quite similar. Okay, let's speak briefly about intergenerational mobility. So this relates quite strongly to what is called the American dream, the idea that anyone from anywhere in America can make it with enough efforts. It's deeply related to the idea of meritocracy. If you put in what you must, then you will get out what you deserve. How do we measure this? Well, economists generally tend to look at the change in income over time. Sociologists are more looking at status or occupation. And this can be intergenerational, so changes between parent and child, or intragenerational, so changes over the course of a lifetime. Generally, though, I think most people consider this first one. We can measure it by what is called the elasticity of intergenerational earnings. So essentially, the question this measure answers is the following. So if a father's earnings increase by 1%, how much do we expect the son's income to be affected? So how much do we expect the son's income to increase? Okay, so essentially, here we have data that has been estimated for various OECD countries. And the higher the value, the more persistence of earnings across generations. So the greater the role of perhaps nepotism or connections that your father gives you or your mother gives you in getting into the job market and securing you a place. It might not just be nepotism. It might be simply, education. If your parents invest a lot in your education, then you would be expected to also have a high income. But note that you can only invest in education in some countries if you have a high income, and so that generates this persistence. Generally, what we find is, typically Scandinavian economies have a lower intergenerational earnings elasticity because there's large state expenditures on education. So that's why we see Denmark, Norway, Finland, also Austria is quite equal in this sense. On the other hand, we have Britain, the US, Italy. Generally, these advanced Western economies that seem to show that there is this persistence of earnings across generations. So here we're saying that if a father in Britain gets a pay rise, then essentially 50% of that will be transmitted one way or another to his children. Yeah. When we then conduct the research over a long period of time, of course. So here we already see, that these economies here on the right tend to be more unequal or have a high persistence of inequality than these economies here on the left. And Germany, we see, is somewhere in the middle. Note that this was conducted using a sort of summary of various papers, and the summary was published in 2010. So the data was taken over the 1990s to 2010, around that. Okay, so again, perceptions matter. I won't go into too much detail here, but I did find it interesting, so I thought I'd include it in the slides. Perhaps if you're interested, you can pause or look at the PowerPoint or the slides that I upload. But again, the perceived level differs quite dramatically in some economies than the actual level of mobility between economies.